Welcome back to Middle Earth, and in today's video we're going to be looking at the Red Minstrel. Now before we get further into the video, I just wanted to say that I'm not exactly the best Red Minstrel. I'm not setting benchmark on this class, but I do know a few things and I'm hoping to teach that. So this video is aimed at kind of newer to slightly more experienced players, but not the super elite raiders, because obviously there'll be little nuances that I just haven't picked up or won't be able to convey properly. But enough about that, let's have a look at why this class is just so damn good. Minstrel in general, but also Red Minstrel, has been buffed substantially in this expansion. Minstrel in general is amazing because it's bringing raid-wide anthems, and these anthems increase DPS and increase survivability. It is pretty much mandatory to have a Minstrel, whether it's a DPS or a heal Minstrel, in every raid group because these anthems are just so damn good. Also, Red Minstrel from the beginning of the expansion has been pretty much the top single target DPSer. Now the rotation is incredibly tough and very fast paced, but even as a newer player, you'll still be able to get out a ton of DPS. Minstrel also brings AoE tactical mitigation reduction, which is extremely good for a lot of classes. Although predominantly physical damage has seemed to be preferred quite nicely in the raid, it'll always be the case whether you run in Wardens or some other classes where you do want a little bit of tactical mitigation reduction. But the extreme god tier ability that Minstrels are bringing to the raid, 3-man, 6-mans, you name it, is Call to Greatness. Call to Greatness resets an extreme amount of skills. It allows your raid group to pump up more DPS, gain more survivability, and deal with mechanics. A lot of the times we'll even have 2 Minstrels in the group, 1 healing, 1 DPSing, and this allows us to use this effect twice, allowing us to pump down adds or bosses in burn phases easier. Now that I've sold you on Minstrel, let's have a look at one or two of the drawbacks. Some of the drawbacks is it is light armor, which means your mitigations are going to be lower than if you ran a Warden or a Champion or something else that could do damage and also bring some sort of supporting abilities. And the second negative I would say is that the rotation is very hard. Obviously it's easy to do a mediocre DPS, but to do absolute top tier best single target DPS in game, you're going to have to play like an absolute pianist. Now let's have a look at some gear and stats. Obviously I predominantly play blue Minstrel, so my Red Minstrel gear is not super well set up. So take these numbers with a bit of a pinch of salt. First of all, sort out your mitigations. Mitigations you can get from a variety of sources, including your main stat. So good to have some will in there to try and help your mitigations. You should try get above 100k minimum. And especially if you are doing tier 3 content, you might maybe want to push these numbers up towards the 130 cap mark. Remember, there's different caps for different tiers, but it ends at tier 3. And do take note that physical and tactical mitigations can be affected by store items as well as scrolls, but also things like your Anthem of Composure will give you a little bit of extra tactical mitigations. Mitigations are incredibly important because if you melt and die in a raid, you probably will be kicked out of the raid because you're just too glassy. But obviously you can use swapper pieces like I do, so in certain fights where there's more physical damage, I'll run a little bit low to pump out a bit more DPS, and when we get to more tactical fights, I'll swap out a few pieces for more tactical mitigations. Then your next most important stat is crit. You need to try get your crit rating as high as possible towards the 225k cap. This will allow you to get as much crit as possible because the build relies very heavily on crit. You obviously want to make sure that you've got some finesse higher towards higher tiers to try and make sure that your attacks are not being resisted, because remember that physical classes will have BPEs to deal with, blocks, parries and evades, but when the target is turned away from them and they're attacking from behind, predominantly they only have to deal with evade chance because the target can't block or parry from behind, meaning they can run lower finesse. But as a tactical class, whether you're playing a Lawmaster, a Runekeeper or a Minstrel, you need to run slightly higher finesse because you will go up against resistances rather than BPEs. Once you've got your crit rating and your mids as high as possible with a bit of finesse, the rest of your stats should just go into tactical mastery. You should get a fair amount of tactical mastery without even trying as a Minstrel. Morale also is something you can be in mind of, but generally as a Minstrel you won't have to worry too much. I would say anything over 200k is adequate to go into tier 2, tier 3, but obviously the higher you go, the better, especially with mitigations. This can make you quite tanky. Now let's have a quick talk at gear. Obviously your gear you take is based on the stat priority. Remember, mitigation's fairly decent, then crit, then a little bit of finesse, and then make sure that you got as much attack mastery as you can, based around that being your last factor that you think of almost. With that being said, you want to try get the 3-piece of the purple set as you start. So you'll need to start running your tier 3 Isles and whatever to try get your higher chance. Now you'll be able to get 2 pieces out of Isle, and then you will have to step into the tier 1 raid to get another piece, or into the arena, the 6-man. Although I feel that the tier 1 raid is much easier than arena. Now the reason that we want the 3-piece purple set for the Red Minstrel is because of the plus 2% critical chance to balance. That is mentally strong for our rotation, so it's pretty much the first thing you should aim for as a Red Minstrel. So even if you end up playing blue in the 3-mans, try save up to try and get yourself this set as quickly as possible. Then once that happens, you can try and aim for maybe the 2-piece blue set. You'll be able to get boots out of tier 1 at the last boss. It's a 50% chance to drop as far as I understand from the chart I was shown. So that's a fairly high chance. So you should get the boot and then maybe grab one other piece if you can in a tier 2 or a tier 3. That gives you another 4% critical chance to balance. So in total, we're getting an extra 6% crit chance on balance, which is massive, because you'll see why when we get to the rotation concept. Now, as I said before, I'm predominantly putting all my resources into Blue Minstrel, so I haven't got my 6-piece red set yet. But what I would maybe suggest is keeping the 3 purple and the 2 blue pieces until you get to a full 6-piece teal set for red, and then switch over. I would imagine this would give you the most DPS output, but I could be wrong. And then when it comes to the instrument, just make sure that you also have an instrument with critical chance to balance. This is incredibly important for our DPS rotation. Now let's have a look at legendary items. My legendary items are slightly incorrect, but I will show you exactly how to fix them as we go. So first, for heraldries, we're looking at Heraldry of the Keen Eagle. Now the reason why I like this is it teams up nicely with the Heroic Precision Words of Craft, although this is the incorrect way to do it. You can either do heraldries of the Keen Eagle, or you can do the ones that give you the 15% light damage as your heraldries. Then you should either do the Ascended Light or Heroic Precision for your first set of Words of Craft, but you should look at the Tactical Critical Multiplier as your other 2 Words of Craft. That extra damage is going to come in massive when it comes to your rotation. Now when it comes to Words of Power, we're fairly set in stone. You definitely want the single attack damage and the single attack critical damage. This is pretty much the first Word of Power or tracery that you should look for a gold. That extra crit chance is going to be massive for your DPS because we do want to load up our ballads. Then Area of Effect damage is something that we definitely want to go for to help us with our AoE damage. The Area of Effect target count is pretty much the one tracery that you can look at replacing, but I haven't seen anything that I would rather take over this for now. Now for our Words of Mastery, the ones that we definitely want to prioritize is your Minor Ballad damage and your Piercing Cry damage. That is a lot of our consistent sustained DPS. So if you can try get those towards gold early, that is obviously really good. Then we want to load up all of our AoE and general damage. Call of Aram, Call of the Second Age, Call to Fate Crit Multiplier, all those sorts of things are very good. But before we should even think about that, we need to obviously deal with our anthems. Remember, you might be producing solo anthems. So anthem duration is extremely important because that extra 30 seconds is going to make keeping up all 3 of your anthem buffs, or technically 5, a lot easier. So you definitely want to get that, and then you want to get the extra effects on anthems, so the war and prowess damage buffs, as well as the Anthem of Composure tactical resistance. This will help us produce better anthems on our raid group or 3-man or 6-man, making us a lot more vital in the long run. Now those of you with a keen eye would notice that I have taken a slight noob trap. I've taken target resist ballads. The reason why this is not a good tracery to take in my opinion is because we already have the target resist cries and calls. You'll notice that our minor ballad is skill type buff,
but its resistance on target is cry, meaning that this tracery already deals with some of the finesse that we need. So to take a double means, yes, our ballads won't get resisted as much, but we should be running enough finesse to make sure that nothing gets resisted. The last ones is pretty much something that people might not really know, and that is perfect ballad damage. We'll get into it in the rotation concept why this is very important, but just know that it is quite an important one to take. And then obviously rally cooldown. Being able to have that res is extremely important. Obviously being able to get this in gold is also really strong because it gives you an extra 30 seconds, making it quite valuable for your raid group.
Now let's have a look at our traits and specializations. This is the tree I've been using, although I find it fairly flawed, and I will suggest a few things you can and should change. First of all, let's have a look at our virtues. Virtues are fairly easy. There are a few things I would change about this. I have taken tolerance for the tactical mitigations, pumping that up, although I do find the resistance a little bit not as great. Although it's not the worst in the world, wisdom is pretty much your must-have. As a DPS, this is too good to pass up. Which is okay, but I do not actually think it's as good as confidence would be. I think having the extra crit chance as your main stat on your virtue is going to give you a lot more utility than wit is giving you. Although if you do need finesse, wit is a very strong skill to have. Then for your survivabilities, I always like things that give tactical and physical mitigations. So I would say compassion is an extremely positive one. I would go for that. I think I will switch out loyalty to compassion when compassion is at 90, and then I like fidelity because that's giving me some high tactical mitigations, a little bit of vitality and physical mitigations, and tolerance is not too bad. Now back to the trait tree. You'll notice a massive theme here. First of all, the fundamentals increase in ballad damage as well as your coda damage. Coda is obviously the thing you cash out your ballads with. So loading up your ballads and your coda mean that you're going to be doing a fair high amount of DPS. That skill trait leads into piercing ballads. Piercing ballads is the most important trait for our purposes at this point. 15% critical chance to ballads as well as a large amount of finesse. That crit chance to ballads is huge. Remember, we're getting the capped at 25% crit chance on our stats. Then on top of that, we're getting from all of those traceries that we've put in, we're getting huge amount of crit chance, especially on ballads. Remember, we're also getting maybe the 3-piece purple set, maybe the 2-piece blue set on top of that. That's like another 6% crit chance to ballads. And then we follow it up with this skill, critical strikes. This increases all crit chance by 5% as well. So we're getting tons of crit chance, and especially on ballads, which is extremely important. Then on top of that, in our first row, we want to go for concussive shout. This increases our crit chance on our piercing cry by 30%. So that's going to allow that skill to crit more often and doing a lot more big DPS. Now, obviously, we've already gone through piercing ballads. Then we will go on to dissonant cries, increasing cry and core damage by 25%. You'll notice that a lot of skill type is cry and core, meaning that all of these skills will be buffed from that skill. You'll notice two things. You'll notice skill type and resistance type. Skill type is when we generated what it is, and resistance type is the target's resistance to that specific effect. Then also in the second row, we will go for Call of Arom. This skill reduces tactical mitigations by 2.5%, and also when we generate it further with the third row, this increases the amount of targets affected and the damage. So this skill can affect up to 12 targets, do massive damage, and reduce their mitigations. This is huge for DPS as well as also just team general gameplay. If you have things like Wardens or Rune Keepers or anything that are doing large amounts of AoE DPS, the amount of debuffing that this skill can do is incredible. Now in the third row, again, we have an incredibly strong trait, Embolden and Finish. When we have 3 points into this trait, it is 100% chance that ballads will imply a stacking buff. And then when we use our coda, we will basically gain this massive 15% outgoing damage buff for 12 seconds. That is something we need to try juggle on ourselves as often as possible to get max DPS. And then in row 3 again, we have a super strong trait, Enduring Morale. not only are we gaining 27k morale for just taking this trait at 5 stacks, we're also gaining a 1 second Call of the Second H stun. Now this stun is incredibly strong to try also interrupt groups of mobs, as well as just help reduce damage, especially if you're thinking of things like your 3-mans, your 6-mans. When there is a large pull and there are so many adds to control, yes, some of the tanks or champs or whatever might have some sort of stun effect, but having this just allows you to help reduce damage while doing massive DPS with Call of the Second Age. And then in row 4, we have Anthem of War. This is a non-negotiable. You have to take it and you have to maintain it all the time for your raid group or even just while you're out in open world. And then we have Song of Ardor, 25% light damage, just super strong for your DPS purposes. However, row 6 is absolutely goated and loaded. Fierce Cries increase crying call damage, crit multiply by 20%. That is massive for DPS. And then of course we have improved Coda of Fury. This is a 50% chance that when you use your Coda, you'll reset all your cries and calls, meaning Cry of the Chorus, your Call of Aram, and also all of these amazing skills, Wizard's Cry, Call of the Second Age, Call of the Valor. This is a massive skill. You can't get it more than once every 25 seconds, but because we are going to be juggling the buff from Emboldened Finished, we'll have to try use our Coda more than once every 10 to 12 seconds to try and juggle that buff, meaning that this will just passively happen. So just keep an eye out when all of a sudden you see these skills magically come off of cooldown. Now for our capstone, Echoes is a very strong ability. All damage and skills, cries and calls have a 33% chance to apply a dot that can stack 3 times. This probably won't be juggled all the time, but it will be up a lot of the time, making it quite a strong skill to be aware of. Maybe you might want to stagger some of these skills to try and make sure that you're maintaining that buff or not overcapping, shall I say, but I don't think you should play around it too much as we're not really predominantly geared for dot damage. Then the other massive skill, Cry of the Wizards. Cry of the Wizards is an extremely strong hitting skill, an AoE skill that's just going to do a ton of damage, as well as obviously have a chance to proc echoes. Now we will go into yellow. Your first choice here is Anthem of Composure. Extremely strong. We're gaining tactical mitigations and resistances, and also mitigations to specific damage types. This is incredibly strong, and as a minstrel, whether you're playing solo, you're playing a single minstrel in a raid group, or 2 minstrels, you should probably take this skill anyway. Then you should probably only put 4, not 5 points into Memories of Battle, just so that you can get to the next capstone. Then we will go for All of Trades. This basically is just extra damage, so we are extremely happy with this. There we go. I redid my trade tree because I couldn't look at it any longer. Thunderous Codas, we need to put all 5 points into that so that we can get that incredible 5% outgoing damage for 30 seconds. Remember, we are going to be using Coda more often to try juggle Embolden and Finish, meaning we'll maintain this quite easily. Then in row 3, we will want Tactical Mastery. Not just are we gaining 10.5k Tactical Mastery, which means more DPS, we're gaining 5% tactical mitigations for free. That is huge for our survivability. Then Anthem of Prowess. Anthem of Prowess would generally suit better more of your melee damage, your champs, mariners, things like that. But yeah, incredibly strong and something we need to maintain all the time. Then I have put 1 point into word spreads. You can put that point anywhere you want to, or you can play around with it, and I'll point out kind of where you might pull those points from. In row 4, we definitely want to go for extended anthems. Remember, we do have a tracery that's extending anthems by 30 seconds. That extra 25 seconds is god tier because that's allowing us to put up an anthem and leave it there for longer, not having to think about it. You can pull some points out of that and put them in other places, but I like to try and make my rotation as easy as possible because I'm lazy. Then once you have that, you can go for invigorating anthems. That reduces the cooldown of anthems, so we can use anthems a lot quicker. This allows us to get our anthems up sooner in combat so that we're doing more DPS, more survivability, things like that. Now again, following from that, we will go down for Anthem of the Free People. This is actually a really strong survival and DPSing kind of anthem. We need to maintain it at all times, just like all other anthems. And that leads us to Tale of Tales. This basically gives us extra stats for our anthems. So as we produce anthems, we'll just give our raid group free stats. And now going back to row 4, whoa my goodness, what is the Song of Woe, extra 5% crit chance to ballads. We are loading ballads with crit chance, meaning that they should pretty much crit every time we hit them. That leads on to sharing a story. When we crit with ballads, we reset Piercing Cry. This is pretty much the crux of the entire rotation. We're trying to crit ballads to reset Piercing Cry and use Piercing Cry as often as possible. And you might be wondering why. We'll get into that in the rotation concept. And then the final capstone, Call to Greatness. Call to Greatness is a must-have. Regardless of whatever you're doing, this skill is ridiculously strong and you will use this every single 6-man, every 3-man, every raid. It is such a good skill to have. Now we are going to quickly have a look at the side just to explain a few things. Discordant ballads, basically allowing our ballads to give us a small tactical damage buff. So basically, as you use a ballad, you're going to get a 3% tactical buff, and that's for 8 seconds. You'll be using ballads so often you won't have to think about juggling this buff. Piercing Calls, this basically reduces resistance chance by cries and calls by 10%, meaning you just need less finesse to use those skills. Concentration, basically reducing our attack duration, meaning we're moving and acting quicker on our attacks. This is extremely strong as it helps us basically DPS quicker. Haste is an extremely important skill. Ballads basically reduce cries and calls by 1 second. So basically all these skills over here, your Call of a Ram, your Cry of the Wizard, your Call of the Second Age, blah blah blah, as you're using ballads, you're reducing the cooldown of these skills, meaning that you can use them more often. Now we do obviously have a chance to reset them completely with Coda of Fury. Remember, we did trait it, but that won't happen more than once every 25 seconds. That means that in the off rotation, when this is on cooldown, having that skill reduction on calls and cries means you're pumping up more DPS more often. Freedom is a pretty strange skill. It basically gives you a 10% chance to be able to use Court of Salvation or Raise the Spirit even while in red stance. So pretty much in red stance, your heals will only affect you no matter what heal you use if you try select another target. But this basically unlocks your chance to be able to heal someone else. You'll use it maybe in a 3-man if you're DPSing and you notice that the tank is taking extreme amounts of damage. You can just quickly like pop a Court of Salvation on them. I mean, if not, you have to kind of go over to like Resonant Stance, use a couple of heals, and then switch back to Dissonant Stance just to carry on DPSing. Cry of the Valor is a skill that you unlock as you go further down. It's a DPSing skill with an AoE effect. Extremely strong actually, but most importantly, it can remove 1 corruption. So this is pretty much your ranged corruption removal skill. If not, you have to get into melee range to use Dissonant Strike. And then our capstone red ability, Encore. This gives us a 30% chance that coders will not cash out your ballad buffs. So the way to explain that is we can only use our coda when we have 3 ballads up, any 3 ballads. Once we use this, generally your coda will basically take away those 3 ballad buffs and you'll have to rebuild up your ballads or use your Cry of the Chorus to get them back. We'll get more into this in the rotation. But basically what this means is that when you use your coda, there's a 30% chance that it won't take away those buffs. And if you notice, your codas actually buff you by giving you extra damage and things like that. So it's incredibly strong to not cash that out, because then you can just carry on DPSing without having to build your ballads back up. This also allows you to use your anthems without having to stress about building your ballads back up.
Now let's get into the rotation concept. Again, I would like to say I'm not a very good Red Minstrel. In fact, the guy in the beginning of the video did so much more DPS that I almost think that I want to give up a Red Minstrel overall. But let's go through some of the basics. First things first, you're going to want to get up your anthems. You have to decide whether you want survivability or DPS at the beginning of a fight. So you're basically aiming for Anthem of Composure and Prowess together, or Anthem of War and Dissonance together. Obviously, War and Dissonance will give you a big DPS boost, but Composure and Prowess are going to give you a lot of survivability with minor DPS boosts. But now when it comes to anthems, there's a few things to be aware of. Firstly, different anthems require different amount of ballad buffs. Like Anthem of the Free People requires 3 ballads to get up, Composure requires 1, and Prowess 2. Similarly, with Dissonance you only require 1, and Anthem of War 2. That means that at the start of the fight, your initial reaction is going to be to get up 2 anthems at once. So what you want to do is start off with one ballad, probably going to be minor ballad. Then what you're going to do is get up your dissonance. Then once dissonance is up, you're going to want to use Cry the Chorus immediately to cut that induction and reset your anthems and put up Anthem of War. Now this means that you'll have Anthem of Dissonance and War, which is really strong. That buff looks like that, giving a strong buff to your own light damage, range damage and tactical damage, meaning you're going to get a good DPS output. Now the Anthem of Dissonance looks like this. It's the initial part for light, fire, frost and lightning damage. That is fellowship wide, so the fellowship is getting this entire buff. But one thing that you may not notice is that when you cast anthems, there's also a personal component. So for the Anthem of War, you're getting the Coda critical chance and the tactical critical chance. But for the Anthem of Dissonance, you're getting an amazing effect of 20% cry and call damage. That is personal, meaning that this effect here that lasts for 1 minute 40 seconds, as you can see for the way I've traded and my allies, will need to be reset often enough. So what you want to do is most of the time when you reset this buff here, the Anthem of War and Dissonance, you're going to want to use your Anthem of War so you can get the Coda and Tactical Critical Chance, as that is an extremely good buff that only lasts for 10 seconds. Meaning for 10 seconds you're going to get some big DPS burst output. But every now and then you're going to need to juggle this buff here for the 20% cry and call damage. Now before we get further into the guide, I need to explain a little concept called cut-in. You get certain skills in games like Lord of the Rings, World of Warcraft and Guild Wars, things like that, where are instant skills. Basically, these are usually your interrupt skills. They're instant because you usually need to interrupt or deal with mechanics very quickly, so they will cut animations of other skills. Now in Lord of the Rings Online, different classes have different immediate skills. Generally, they're your kicks or things like this that you use to try and put in for extra DPS, but also to deal with mechanics. Now the Minstrel is extremely blessed as we have 4 immediate skills. We have Cry of the Chorus, we have Piercing Cry, we have Court of Salvation, and we have our flop, Stiller's Death. Although Stiller's Death is usually not usable in most 3, 6 and raid groups. The reason why this is important is this is quite an advanced concept. We basically will be casting skills. Skills by themselves have a pre and post animation, and some are longer than others. So if you cast a skill, you'll notice the damage will go off, but my character will still do a post animation after the damage. Now where skills like immediate skills come in good is when you use them but you cut afterwards, you can get off 2 skills fairly quickly without that interim animation, making us do more DPS quicker. Now obviously you would have remembered from the trait tree that we have sharing a story which basically resets Piercing Cry every time our ballads crit. We have loaded our ballads and our general build with ballad crit chance and crit chance in general, meaning that our ballads will crit more often than not, resetting Piercing Cry, meaning that we can use this to interrupt post animations. Now this is where the big DPS comes from, and why the rotation is hard to master is because pretty much every single post animation from every skill we're going to want to cancel with Piercing Cry. Now this does take a little bit of training, because if you cast Piercing Cry too quickly, you could put a skill on cooldown, but it actually didn't really ever give its effect. So get used to the timing when you practice this rotation. Now the general rotation concept is this: we are going to use a skill, Piercing Cry, and then Minor Ballad to reset or have the chance to reset Piercing Cry. Then we will use the next skill, and if Piercing Cry is reset, we will use it and then Minor Ballad again. Especially people that play with higher latency, this rotation can feel a lot more easier, but when you have good latency, i.e. low latency and very fast internet, you might find that there is split seconds where Minor Ballad is still on cooldown before you can hit that Piercing Cry, making it feel a little more sluggish. Now in your brain you need to think, what is the fight like? If it is a boss fight, we will throw up the Timeless Echoes of Battle. If it's a trash pull, I wouldn't really bother, as it's a bit of a waste of a server tech skill. I would definitely start off with Call of Rom. This can spread 9, perhaps 10 targets minus mitigation debuff, and that tactical mitigation debuff will increase the DPS of Rune Keepers and Wardens and everybody, so everybody's going to be fairly grateful for that. Then what I would do is cut it, Minor Ballad, go into my Call to Fate, cut it, Minor Ballad, and Wizard's Cry, cut it, Minor Ballad, and then maybe Cry of the Valor, unless I feel like I would need to reserve that for corruption removal. Now generally in AoE fights, you're going to prioritize Call of Aram, Wizard's Cry, Call of the Second Age, which isn't actually a very high DPS in skill, but it's quite nice with the stun effect, and then obviously Cry of the Valor. Most importantly to note is also that casting your anthems can also take up quite a lot of animation time. You'll notice that the anthem procced way before my character finished their animation. That means that you even want to cut your anthem putting up by using Piercing Cry if you can. But again, one of the most important things we also want to make sure that we're doing is using our Coda of Fury as often as possible. We want to try get to 5 stacks and then use this so that we can get the big DPS increase. Generally at the start of the fight, you'll probably start off with Cry of the Chorus to get your 3 anthems up. This will allow you to get your first anthem up so that you can start your DPS rotation. Then I would try get towards 5 ballad stacks of Embolden and Finish. Once I have my 5 ballad stacks, I will use Coda of Fury. What this will do is it will give me that massive DPS increase for 12 seconds. The extra effects last longer, but your 15% outgoing damage lasts for 12. In that time, I would then slog around my rotation some more to build up again and use Coda of Fury pretty much off of cooldown. Remember, we do have that extra chance to reset our cries and calls when using Coda of Fury. That won't happen more than every 25 seconds, but that means that Cry of the Chorus will never go off of cooldown because we will always reset it beforehand with our Coda of Fury. We'll pretty much try use this almost off of cooldown, but also we will wait till we try get those 5 stacks pretty much as a given. Now this rotation can feel very quick and very hard because also remember, our ballads are reducing the cooldown of our call and cry skills by 1 second every time we use them, meaning that we'll have a couple of very fast moving rotation cycles. And also our Coda of Fury has the chance to reset all of our cry and call skills, meaning we'll have to do our opening rotation fairly often. Then other nice to know about is if for some reason you don't have Piercing Cry and you want to cut the animation perhaps of one of your anthems, using Cord of Salvation is also a very strong thing to do. It is on a 12-second cooldown, meaning it is off cooldown a lot often, meaning that we can cut these animations fairly easy as well as giving ourselves a good heal. Then obviously you'll bubble yourself with the Song of the Hammer Hand or an ally with the Gift of the Hammer Hand, and then use Call to Greatness only when your raid leader has told you to use it. Especially if there's more than one minstrel in the raid group, you need to be very careful when using this, as you can only gain the effect once every 2 minutes, so you don't want to grief the team by using it at the same time as another minstrel. And now last things last, there will be a bit of a time in your rotation where all your big hitting skills are on cooldown. In that case, what we will do is do the exact same rotation, but we will use Perfect Ballad instead of one of the other skills. Now obviously we don't get this that often on our rotation, but there is a time, and there should be times, where everything is pretty much on cooldown. And then what you will do is you'll use Minor Ballad, but as you push Minor Ballad, you will push Piercing Cry immediately afterwards in the hopes of a reset. The reason why you push Minor Ballad and immediately after Piercing Ballad is because if it resets, you want it to pretty much interrupt the post animation of your Minor Ballad, and the same for Perfect Ballad. That is why we do recommend taking the legacy of the Perfect Ballad to make sure that even when we're hitting the skill, we're getting a little bit of extra DPS. Now, if you are interested in add-ons, obviously you don't need add-ons to make this work. The only add-ons I would recommend is something to obviously track your anthems. Being able to keep up perfect anthem uptime is highly important in terms of your raid and gameplay. Having an anthem drop could mean a wipe in certain groups, especially when you're doing tier 5 content. And then obviously I have Gibberish, and that tracks my buffs of Embolden and Finish. So basically I have one that just tracks when I get to 5 stacks, so I know basically when to use my Coda of Fury. Then when I do cast it, I have the timer that tells me how long I have for the 12-second buff timer. That just helps me identify when to use some of my bigger hitting skills, and if possible build back up for Coda of Fury again to try juggle that buff as often as possible. Now that is going to be very tough to juggle, but if you can, obviously it is extremely important to do. Then also another thing you can do is either use gibberish or buff bars to track your personal anthem buff, especially for the lesser anthem of dissonance. This will just give you some sort of barrier to know when to refresh this buff so that you don't let it drop off.
And that's it. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really hope this has helped you with your Minstrel gameplay. And yeah, I'm pretty much hoping to make a couple of guide videos for some of the classes I have a little bit of knowledge about. If you did enjoy the video, please like, subscribe, all that cool stuff. It really helps the channel grow. And if you didn't enjoy watching the video, thanks for watching anyway. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.